Hi, my name is Dr. Gavin Grindon. I'm going to give you a short taster lecture for the BA in Social Change at Essex, where I'm going to talk about Black liberation movements in America from the 1950s onwards. And specifically, we're going to talk about the civil rights movement and its cultural forms and its influences and the ways that it's been received and absorbed into mainstream American culture. This movement and its legacies is something that's been heavily represented in American culture, and we're going to think about those representations as well, and are they misrepresentations? So you have examples of all these movies, some of them very recent, about different Black liberation movements and figures in those movements. And we can think of some very famous specific examples that you might already be familiar with. And we can think also about some of the debates around them, about how they might have also been misrepresented. The most famous example of the civil rights struggle, of course, is Rosa Parks, and how in 1955, the buses in Montgomery were segregated into areas for Black and white commuters. And this story goes, at the end of the day of a shift as a seamstress making clothes for white people, she was told she couldn't sit anywhere when there were still spaces in the white area, and she had to get off the bus. She ignored the bus driver's instruction and went and sat down. This was an act of kind of non-violent direct action. The police were called and she was arrested. This story has been much told, well covered. You can even see, it made the basis of an episode of Doctor Who a couple of years ago. And of course, the ex-president Obama had himself photographed as part of his PR sitting in her seat on that bus, which is now kept in a museum. This has kind of become a heavily mythologized part of American history, right? It's part of a story of this dream, right? And what it means. And we might want to think critically about how this dream's been represented, how it's been mythologized, and pick it apart. One of the myths that we might want to look past, if any of you saw maybe the Doctor Who episode from a couple of years ago, that represented Rosa Parks as a lady who was fed up. And she was tired, she'd had a long day, she didn't want to follow the rules anymore. And in reality, she was an experienced labor organizer. She had much more in common with the Alabama communists who we'd looked at. And what she did was a very savvy political move. She was part of a long-term strategy of organized social activism. What she did was intentional, thoughtful. It was intended to be a political action. And it was intended to be part of a movement and a way to grow a movement. And it was very successful. So that episode of Doctor Who kind of erases a lot of her activist knowledge, her identity as a political organizer, and the work that would have gone into that, into planning and organizing something like this. And what it does then is effectively, through this myth, take away her agency, as if she just sparked this, huge protest movement that would have repercussions right up to today, not just by accident one day. She sat in the wrong place on a bus. This is a very common misrepresentation of Rosa Parks, but also of protests more generally. Right? Protests are often represented, especially if they're particularly effective, turning points in a campaign or in a struggle. They're often represented as like magical moments, sudden changes, things that just came out of nowhere. One day, everything changed. And these representations often kind of do away with or make invisible years of work and struggle by activists which stand behind them. And those activists themselves, often in this process, are either mythologized, as in the case of Rosa Parks, or demonized, as is the case more often. So what all of this mythologizing, this making of dreams obscures for us often is how the change happens, how to do it. How did Rosa Parks sitting in the wrong place or the right place on a bus spark this big movement? How does this, what was the strategy? What was the thinking? How does a protest movement win? Right? These are the kinds of questions that get swept away when we don't think about this stuff. Parks's action was intended to be a spark, right? Intended to build up a wider movement, and it worked. A mass meeting was called by another experienced union organizer after she was arrested, and it was proposed and agreed to boycott all of the buses. Some people got rides from friends. Most people walked. The segregationists who opposed them turned towards violence. One of the organizers of this boycott was a young man named Martin Luther King, a young pastor in his late 1920s. And you may be very familiar with his story from the recent movie Selma. And he again experienced, the violence of the segregationists. He had his house bombed, but it didn't put the protesters off. In 1956, their campaign was successful as well. Segregation on the buses was officially outlawed by the Supreme Court. Again, something that still would have continued informally, but the legal victory had been won. The tide had been turned in this particular moment. So this strategy, the bus boycott, set the style for the civil rights movement. It was going to be about nonviolent direct action as a strategy for change. So this is the how of that movement. Its answer to how do you make change. And the legacies of that strategy and of its success in this particular historical moment are still with us today, right? When it comes to Black Lives Matter demonstrations, when it comes to Extinction Rebellion blocking roads, countless other protest movements. This has been kind of it's a lauded and much mythologized strategy for how to change the world. And again, we might want to think about this as its mythology. Is it always the most appropriate way to change things? Is it always the most successful way to change things? Or does it depend upon certain conditions that might or might not be the case in a particular time and place? So I work in the University of Essex as an art historian, and I'm not so interested in paintings. I am interested in the arts of social movement, in the arts of rebellion, and how new forms of protest are invented and developed. Different movements, the civil rights struggle being one example, invent new repertoires of protest, new ideas, new practices that we draw from, like riffs and chord progressions in music, that make up new styles of music, and then which artists borrow from each other. Protest tactics work in a very similar way, right? Whether it's the demonstration march, the protest banner, the placard, the website DDoS attack, or the graffiti stencil, all of these things are appropriated by different protest movements and used in different ways. Just like the way musicians will borrow particular kind of musical stylings, musical elements, drum beats, riffs from other artists who've influenced them and adapt them to a new circumstance. Protest works in the same way. It has its own art and it has its own culture. So let's have a look at one example of the invention of one of the most major political forms of the 20th century, something we still see all the time today in the news, something you might have even practiced yourself. And it's more or less invented and formalized by the civil rights movement, and it comes after this moment of the bus boycott. On the 1st of February 1960, 4 freshmen at Black College in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided to sit down at the Woolworth's lunch counter downtown, where only white people were permitted to sit and eat. They were refused service, but they refused to leave, stayed in their seats. As a response, the lunch counter was closed for the day. They came back the next day, and then the next day. And as they did, other Black people came to sit with them silently at the closed lunch counter, occupying the seats, causing disruption non-violently, making their point, and costing the restaurant money, right? They weren't able to operate. They were being disruptive. This style of action, this kind of sit-in, spread to 15 cities across the South. The tactic went viral. And there were lots of violence against those conducting the sit-in. By the end of the year, 50,000 people were participating in these sit-ins, and segregation in restaurants had been ruled illegal. So again, it could only be continued informally. And this idea of this occupation of space, occupation of public space, the refusal to move as a kind of blockade of social life, and it's stress on non-violence. You'll notice that people don't fight back, they don't defend themselves in these videos. All of this became a very influential form, right? And there was a particular strategy here of, on the one, well, which we can understand in various ways. We can understand it as a liberal appeal to reason and to ethics, to set an example, and to make that example passively, non-violently, passive resistance, rather than to damage the message, as they would argue, by resorting to violence. And you might think of it also as a very smart early form of mediatization of protest, right? This is the 1960s, the era of the mass expansion of photography, of the use of photography in newspapers, and of course, black and white television across the States. So this was one of the first protests that would have been heavily mediated, and one of the first, nationally mediated protests. Pictures and videos of these protests would have spread around, would have made exciting footage for the news. And the protesters used those images and their self-representation in those images very strategically. They thought about what they would look like, how they would be seen, and what those images would mean very carefully, which was, again, part of the logic between the non-violent resistance, to make visible the violence against them and to make that visible violence spread by using the representation in the media. Now, this form was very influential throughout the 1960s, right up to today. You can see some of these dates on the screen. The first teach-in in 1968. So this is students in the States protesting against the war in Vietnam, would occupy their universities. Their teachers, lecturers would join them. And instead of having a sit-in in a restaurant, they would have a teach-in in a student union, a hall of residence, a university lecture hall, and refuse to leave. They would camp out in there. We have the first kiss-ins in 1976 by queer and gay liberation movements. Again, occupying public space with their lives, with the thing that was outlawed or forbidden, and relying on the reaction of people to mediate this. And then a decade, so we're just moving through the decades here, again in queer movements with the ACT UP movement in New York, who were protesting about government inaction or the stigmatizing of people with AIDS and the lack of treatment and the profit making around that treatment. They conducted the first die-ins. So the same kind of tactic as occupation of space, but with an added theatrical element, right? Making the problem even more visible. They invented the die-in, which you'll have seen many times since in protests around issues of human rights, around issues of war, and so on. So this has been a really successful strategy. You think today of any, in the 2000s flash mobs, if you think of back in 2012, the Occupy protests that you may remember seeing on the news, all of these things are indebted to this form, right? All of these are forms of occupying non-violently public space, causing a disruption, and thinking about the media representation, right, of the issue and of the actors around this issue. Sociologists of social movements call these different tactics repertoires of contestation, which sounds very dry, and analyze them and their development. Like, how do these movements borrow particular ideas from each other? How do they develop and change? How do they provoke? And this is about the crisis of an American idea, right? How how do they enact a dream on one hand, and how do they provoke a political crisis on the other. But these are also, I mean, repertoires of contestation sounds very dull. These are also cultural forms, right? They're woven together with song, with performance, with poetry, craft, and art making. So these are also, this is a history of the arts of protest.